Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I'm doing some spring sewing and smocking. I am making the Children's Corner Bishop pattern, View B, size newborn. For the fabric, I got this Peter Rabbit fabric. It is by Riley Blake and I purchased it from Farmhouse Fabrics. This is a border print fabric, so that means it's got a border along the selvage edge. So I started out by removing the white part of the selvage so that I just had the strip of pink fabric right under the border. When cutting out the pattern pieces, I placed the dress, front, back, and sleeve pieces so that the border ran along the hem. The remaining three pieces were bias strips for the sleeve cuffs as well as the neckband. Up next is the pleating. This is the most time-consuming part just because of the method that I use, which I learned from the channel Sarah Classic Sewing. Start by laying out the pieces in the order they'll be sewn in, then stack them in order ending with the back left piece on top. Now I start running the top piece through the pleater but without threading the needles. Once the fabric starts coming out the other side, I pull the edge of the fabric off the needles, stopping where the back placket ends. That's marked on the pattern, and what I do is I just clip a notch all the way into the fabric to mark that. I leave the rest of the piece on the pleater and go ahead and thread the needles. Then run the remainder of that pattern piece through the pleater. Then I'm unthreading the needles and pulling the last 1/4 inch or so of the pleating threads out of that piece. Now I start running the sleeve piece through next. Pull off the first 1/4 inch of the piece off the needles before threading them again. Finish running the piece through, unthread, remove the last 1/4 inch of the threads from that sleeve, and then repeat for the rest of the pieces. And doing this allows the pleating threads to run through all of the pieces but not into the seam allowance, which means that once I sew my seams, I can still pull on those pleating threads to adjust things because they won't be caught in my stitches. And I'll link the video that I followed in the description. Now you could also just sew the pieces together and run the whole piece through the pleater, but from my understanding there's a higher risk of needles breaking. And as tedious as unthreading and rethreading is, I prefer that over breaking needles. Once all of the pieces are through the pleater, I sew each of the arm seams, pushing all of the pleats away from where I'm sewing so that it lays flat as I stitch. Because this is a round yoke, I use this template to block the pleating. This has lines marking how tight to pull the pleating as well as to mark where the front and back sleeve seams go. I start by pinning the seams to the appropriate lines, keeping that top edge under the circle labeled newborn. I then pull the pleater threads to the right tightness, tie them off, and then even out the pleats. Now I'm running seam over it and I let it sit to set the pleats. For the smocking, I use the Dipsy Doodle smocking plate by Cross-Eyed Cricket. With bishop dresses and other rounded smocking, you do need a specific type of pattern. These are typically ones that start with very tight stitches at the top, like a cable stitch, and then with looser designs as the rows go lower so that the garment will lay flat when worn. In this case, it started with 2 rows of cable stitches followed by a few rows of scallops. Now on my second row smocking, I did realize that I had accidentally skipped some pleats on the previous row. This does happen sometimes, and sometimes I will pull it out, but in this case, because it happened at the beginning of the row, I opted to just keep skipping those pleats on the subsequent rows rather than having to pull the entire row out. I also made a bit of a mistake on the scallops. So at the bottom of the scallops, there's supposed to be like a series of 7 cable stitches at the bottom, and I had misread or miscounted and only ended up doing 5. This isn't a big deal, but it does change things a little on how it looks when each of the lower rows comes up to meet the previous row. But again, rather than pulling everything out, I just went ahead and left it. So it's all kind of technically wrong, but at least it's consistently wrong. And I finished by back smocking the top holding row. This is to hold the pleats in place when I sew over them later. Normally I would just use freezer paper and like iron that onto the back to hold the pleats in place while I sew it, and then the freezer paper just rips away. But because of the shape of the neckline, it just seemed easier to back smock in this case. Then I steamed it again to set the stitches in place. This time I didn't bother with the template. I just made sure it was kind of laying flat before I started steaming. Then I removed the pleater threads. And now I'm folding over the back placket. So on the right side, I folded it over twice so that the placket was completely hidden behind the smocking. For the left side, I also folded it over twice, but it was a narrower fold so that the placket sticks out past the smocking, because this is the side where the buttons will go. I pinned these in place, but I did not sew them yet. Now I'm pinning on the neckband. I fold over the short ends, then pin them to each end of the dress where the placket is folded. I did not block this tight enough, so the dress neckline was a bit too wide, and to kind of get around this, I just kind of gently pushed the pleats closer together and used a lot of pins. Then I sewed that seam, and thankfully the pleats stayed in place and didn't look too wonky from having to shift things around. I think when I used to sew this pattern more often, what I would do is cut the neckband longer than I needed. That way, if this happened, I had enough to just kind of sew it the way it was instead of having to push things closer. I gathered the sleeves and sewed them to the armbands, then sewed the side and back seams. Then folded under the armbands and the neckband and finished them both with a whip stitch. I did the same for the hem, though this is narrower than what the pattern calls for, just because I was trying to avoid folding up too much at the bottom and losing too much of the border. I hand sew the buttons on. These are just flat white buttons. The pattern actually calls for those ones that have like a shank on the back. And on the other side, I sew button loops. This is done just by kind of doing a very long stitch, a little wider than the button, and then coming back and doing almost like a blanket stitch around that bar of thread. I think this little dress turned out very lovely, and I hope it inspires you to do some of your own spring or Easter sewing. Thanks for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.